Okay, everyone, welcome to Great Jewish Personalities. When we left off last week, we had just arrived in the great city of Yavneh, and the Jewish people are in a really bad spot. The temple's destroyed, lots of Jews and lots of Jewish communities are decimated. The crown jewel of Jewish living, the temple, is destroyed as well. And Yavneh, we see, becomes this beacon of light that's going to infuse life and vitality into the Jewish nation. Now, it's important that at this time, there's a tremendous shift in focus and in leadership of the people. Beforehand, we had all these different groups vying for leadership. We had the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Hellenists and the Jewish Christians, all these different various groups, each one of them trying to jockey for position in the leadership of the Jewish people. The noted authorities and individuals, not just groups that are leading the people. Also, you have the Torah scholars, and you have the nationalists, and the Brionim, and the Zealots, and all these different groups that are capturing the mind of the Jewish people. And indeed, if you go back in history, you see that you had different prophets, and you have kings, and you have high priests, and local leaders of the... Everything overnight almost changes. From this point onward, for the next several hundred years, the only authorities, certainly in the land of Israel, that are going to lead the people are the Torah scholars, which in a weird way is a little bit of a silver lining in the aftermath of tragedy, that now there's more unity and focus and leadership that is true to Torah values, and that really was centered in the city and the convention of rabbis in Yavneh. And we see indeed that from this point onward, Yavneh really becomes the seat of leadership for the people. That's where the sages were. The sages were Torah leaders, religious leaders, but also political leaders. We'll see today as well some of the various trips that they had to Rome. They would send delegations to Rome. It wouldn't be the politicians, it wouldn't be the kings or the local leaders, the mayors. It would be the rabbis, the greatest rabbis of the generation. They were also the political leaders, and they were the ones that would go to intercede on behalf of the people with the Romans. Every Jewish community, they would have a group of promising scholars. They would send them to Yavneh to go join the collected cadre of great scholars in Yavneh at the time. Now, who was the leadership of Yavneh? So we meet a very interesting and tremendously talented in every way group of leaders. If you remember last time, we spoke about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, who was the elderly sage of the people of the time. He established Yavneh. He ensured that all the rabbis were able to escape to Yavneh, away from the inferno of Jerusalem and elsewhere. But after Yavneh was established, he quickly left as to not overshadow the leader, the young leader, the Nasi, who was Rabban Gamliel. And Rabban Gamliel, he's the Nasi, so he's the recognized authority, and he wasn't just a political role, it was really a role of scholarship. He was a great Torah scholar, tremendous scholar. There's many teachings of his found in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And he was chiefly responsible for the Jewish people. He was the Nasi, and he was part of a long line all the way from Hillel for hundreds of years of Nisim, which were quasi-kings or princes of the Jewish people from the house of David, from the family of David. Another great leader is Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, his full name is Rabbi Eliezer Ben Hurkenus, otherwise known as Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol. He was one of the prime students of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. If you remember Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, when he was talking about his 5 major students, he said that if you take all the students all the great sages of Israel, and you put them on one side of the scale, and you put Rabbi Eliezer on the other side of the scale, he would outweigh them. And he was the Chacham. The Chacham means he was the recognized Torah authority and the greatest scholar, and indeed the heir, the spiritual heir of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. Now, he has a very interesting backstory. His father was inordinately wealthy, and he wasn't much of a Torah scholar. And Rabbi Eliezer had a tremendous drive, almost a maniacal drive to Torah. We're told in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, which is in the Midrash, that at the age of 28, he decided to dedicate himself full-time to Torah study. Now, his family was very wealthy, very aristocratic family. His father's name is Hurkenus, so obviously he didn't even have a Jewish name. And he was a wealthy landowner, very wealthy family. And this prized son of his decides to go to Jerusalem to go study with the rabbis, and he was very disappointed with that. And Rabbi Eliezer goes and he studies under Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. Eventually he rises to the top to be his prime student. And concurrently, his father is a little bit disappointed with the fact that his son now is going to waste his time with the rabbis studying. So he makes this trip to Jerusalem to go and to formalize the papers disowning his son Eliezer from his inheritance. And that would ensure that, if he's not going to work, if he wants to just sit and study, let him sit and study, but he's not going to have a portion in the estate. So he comes and arrives at Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, and they tell him that, this person that you're meeting, he's the father of the great Rabbi Eliezer, your student Rabbi Eliezer. He says, we'll make it a big party. Makes a big party, and he's sitting there, and all the great people of Jerusalem are there, and Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai calls him and says, I want you to go give a lecture in front of everyone. How can I give a lecture in front of everyone? I have my teacher here, I have all the great rabbis here, I have all the great leaders of Jerusalem here. I can't go. And finally he agreed to go. And the Midrash describes the lecture that he gives. He gives this just amazing lecture, and he's almost from a different world. The Midrash describes that his face was as bright as the sun. There was an eminence. There was a glow that he had. The spiritual glow of Olam Haba was just permeating from him. Everyone there was just totally spellbound by this performance. And when he finished, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai went and kissed him on his forehead and says to him, praiseworthy are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that someone like this, someone like Rabbi Eliezer, came from their descendants. And then he goes over to Hurkenus, Rabbi Eliezer's father, and says, by the way, that guy, you don't recognize him. He's been here for a couple of years and grew a nice long beard. He's actually your son. He's like, what? That's my son. And he says, you know what? Let me change the documentation. I'm not disowning him. In fact, I'm giving him the entirety of my estate. So he tries to sign off the entirety of the estate. And Rabbi says, no, just give me the portion that I would have had as if, along with all the rest of your sons. And indeed, for the rest of his life, he's going to be very wealthy, which is always interesting to see the dynamics where you have the great scholar who's wealthy. On the other hand, his primary colleague is Rabbi Yehoshua. We'll meet it as well, the other great leader of Yavneh, who was very, very poor. And in the society of that time, and indeed the way really things ought to be, people are judged as their merits. It was a meritocracy. Thus, Rabbi Eliezer was very wealthy and could potentially wield a lot of influence. He was considered an equal to Rabbi Yehoshua, who was very, very poor. And because they were both great in Torah, that's how they were valued. Rabbi Eliezer lived in Lud. He married a woman by the name of Ima Shalom. She is the sister of Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel is the Nasi. Rabbi Eliezer is the Chacham. And Rabbi Eliezer is married to Rabban Gamliel's sister. Her name was Ima Shalom. And she's also the daughter of the previous prince. Because remember, the princehood, that's going in a succession, in biological succession. Hillel's son, Rabban Gamliel, his son is Shimon, and his great-grandson is Rabban Gamliel, the second Rabban Gamliel, and his brother-in-law is Rabbi Eliezer. Now, the Talmud testifies about Rabbi Eliezer some unbelievable qualities that he had. It says that he never allowed someone to precede him to the synagogue, to the house of study. So if the learning schedule starts at 9 a.m., he was always there beforehand. And if some guy says, I'm going to get there at 8:45 and I'll beat him, he says, no, I'll get to 8:40. He always was the first to leave, first to arrive, and last to leave. Like his teacher before him, he didn't sleep in the house of scholarship. Never in his life did he have any idle chit-chat. And also, he never taught Torah that was not taught to him by his teacher. He was a vessel, a funnel of his teacher's Torah, and that's what he taught forward. And it's really interesting because there's another statement in the Talmud that seems to be in direct opposition to this. This Talmud says elsewhere that Rabbi Eliezer would give lectures and he would say teachings that no ear heard before. He said things that were totally innovative ideas that were never taught before. So on one hand, he taught only things that he heard from his teacher. On the other hand, he taught things that no one had ever heard before. The answer is that he was such a consummate student that even his own independent Torah thoughts that he developed on his own were in the same manner, in the same flavor, as if Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, his teacher, could have said that. He incorporated the approach of his teacher so that even the novel Torah insights were almost as if Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai himself was the one teaching him. And the third of the triumvirate of Yavneh is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania. And he, like Rabbi Eliezer, was a student of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. He was called the Av Beis Din, the head of the Sanhedrin. And he had a very different backstory because the Talmud tells that when he was just a tiny little baby and he was in a little stroller, his mother, would bring him into the house, into the yeshiva. And even though he didn't understand anything as a little baby, but the reason why is, she said, because let his ears cleave to words of Torah. And that's why he was almost like consecrated from birth, so to speak, to be dedicated entirely to Torah. And in fact, when Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai is enumerating the qualities of his students, when he gets to Rabbi Yehoshua, of his 5 major students, when he gets to Rabbi Yehoshua, he says, Rabbi Yehoshua, Ashrei Yoladato, praiseworthy are those that gave birth to him, i.e. his mother, who set him on a path of Torah scholarship. And he, unlike Rabbi Eliezer, was very poor. He lived in a small little hut. And despite being one of the very greatest Torah leaders in Torah greatness, in every field of Torah greatness, being a great statesman, he was always the one who would be on the debate team. The Talmud records numerous debates that he had with the great Roman philosophers of his day. Whenever they wanted someone to represent the Jewish people, it was always Rabbi Yehoshua. Despite being a recognized noted leader, he lived in terrible, deep poverty, and he had made a humble livelihood by making needles. He would make needles, and the Talmud describes that the walls of his tiny little hut were blackened with the soot of the charcoal fire that he used to make his needles. Now, these were the primary leaders of Yavneh, but also Rabbi Akiva already arrives at Yavneh at the time, and there's many, many hundreds of students over there, and Torah again is beginning to boom and flourish in Israel. Now, although they had the rights from the Romans to gather and to study, they had to tread very lightly, especially at the beginning. And in fact, when Yavneh was beginning to burgeon, the Romans were a little bit wary of this growing, presence, so to speak, that the Jewish people had. They were, the Jews were notorious for always rebelling, and the Jews had just pulled off the greatest rebellion in the history of the Roman Empire with the Great Revolt and the Battle of Jerusalem and the Battle of Israel. And now they see that the Jews are once again have life to them. And they're led again by this leader, by Rabbi Gamliel. So even though Vespasian had committed to not go after Rabbi Gamliel and his family, they put out an edict for his arrest and execution. The Talmud tells what happened. This is the Talmud in Tainus, page 29. When Turnus Rufus the wicked, Turnus Rufus is one of the Roman leaders, when he was plowing the temple, they made an edict, a decree on Rabbi Gamliel that they should kill him. Now, what does it mean that he was plowing the temple? They destroyed the temple. The temple was built upon a huge mountain, Temple Mount, in order to just root out any hope of the Jewish rebellion and resistance. They undertook a project to actually plow the mountain, to take the plateau and lower it, and to give the ultimate shame, that not only destroy the building that the temple was, and that was the center of Jewish life, but also going to raise the actual mountain that it was standing on. So they made this edict on Rabban Gamliel, and there's, the Roman official who was in charge of executing that order, he came to the House of Scholarship, and he kind of announced, oh, by the way, I happen to be here with this document that says that I'm supposed to capture, and execute Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel gets, he hears about this and he quickly hides. And the person comes to him in privacy and says to him, listen, I want to rescind this order, but you have to promise me that I'm going to be granted a portion of the world to come if I do that. Rabbi Gamliel promises him. He climbs up onto the top of the roof. He jumps off the roof, commits suicide. And in Roman rule, when someone who was the bearer of a decree, when he dies in the act of executing that order, then the decree is rescinded. So Rabbi Gamliel, the decree of Rabbi Gamliel was rescinded, and that person indeed merited to have a portion in Olam Haba, which really shows you that although the Romans were very hostile to the Jewish people, there was still that feeling of deep connection, or at least amongst many individuals, that they knew the Jews were right and they had something really special, and their Torah made sense and their Torah was true, and thus we see an instance where someone is willing to give up their lives to ensure that Jewish continuity will exist and to secure themselves a place in Olam Haba, which is really remarkable. Now, over the course of the next few decades of Yavneh, there are going to be ups and downs and ebbs and flows in the security of the community at Yavneh. There are going to be several times where they're going to have to flee Yavneh, or at least disband, and the rabbis are going to split up into various different groups and go to different cities, because the Romans were very wary. We have 1,000 rabbis coming together, very powerful, impactful, great visionary leaders, and that was something that they were very concerned about, so they would sometimes go underground as well. Now, the first mission that they undertook after the temple was destroyed was to address the more immediate problems facing the people and to try to rescue the remnants of the people of Israel from the Roman persecution. So in fact, the Talmud tells that these three leaders, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Yeshua, were sent to Rome as a delegation to visit Titus and to petition him to alleviate the oppressions of Rome towards the Jewish people. They got to Rome and they made a big impact upon the local populace. These were very impressive people. And indeed, we learn about what happened to some of the people of the nobility and aristocracy of Rome, that we have a list of people that actually converted because of their encounter with these great people. Now, before they got to Rome, or before they got to speak to Titus, he was assassinated by his brother. But that kind of shows what the role that they undertook. They undertook a role to, initially at least, to try to intercede on the behalf of the Jewish people and to alleviate their pain and suffering. At this time, we also see a intense, concentrated effort to weed out, to ferret out the Judeo-Christians. Remember, the Judeo-Christians were a relatively new offshoot of the Jewish nation proper, the general Jewish nation. And they were Jews who, on top of observance of Torah law, also had a mistaken belief that their hero was the Messiah and he's dead, he's coming back, whatever variety of that idea they held at the time. And this was a big problem because these people outwardly would behave as Jews, they would participate in all, they would do the mitzvahs, and they were Jews by every objective or perceivable manner, yet they were secretly closet Judeo-Christians. And they had beliefs that were against the very foundations of our religion. So you have a problem. You have an enemy almost from within that's very hard to identify. So in Yavneh, they devised a method to ferret them out by the 19th blessing. So we know the Shemona Esrei, or the Amidah, is the prayer that was established by the men of the Great Assembly about 400 to 500 years earlier. Now, it's called the Shemona Esrei because it has 18 blessings. But if you actually count in your Siddur today, you'll find that there's 19 blessings, because one of them was added 300 or 400 years after they were initially instituted in Yavneh by Shmuel HaKatan, one of the scholars of Yavneh. And that was done specifically to curse out the Judeo-Christians. And thus, what they would do is if someone that they suspected was a Judeo-Christian, they would say, oh, why don't you go lead the services? Lead the services, I'm a little nasally today, my throat's hurting. Okay, tomorrow, same thing. If they continually refuse, you know that they're hiding something. Because people will be very resistant to curse themselves out. And that really is an example of a general effort that they had to really cleanse the religion and the leadership and the people of any of these foreign ideas that had infiltrated over the past couple of years. The Sadducees, they were disenchanted with the people. They chose their stripes. They either became Romans or Jews. The Hellenists, all these other groups died out because, in part, of these efforts of the sages of Yavneh to standardize and to clarify and to create unity amongst the people. Now, one of the major problems that they had was in the matters of halacha. In the preceding 100 years, there's a proliferation of machlokas, of halachic disagreements. If you remember, we spoke about Hillel. When Hillel came and established his yeshiva, it was the first time that the Sanhedrin almost was split in two. One of them called Beis Shammai, one called Beis Hillel, different houses of scholarship. And that allowed for not schism, but at least a diversity of halacha amongst those two schools. And in the ensuing 100 years, this became a big problem because, for the 1400 years of our history, all the Jews that were observant, which was almost everyone, of Torah law, there was a unified corpus of practice. There was no really room where one Jew behaved like this and one Jew behaved like that. And that's why at this time, they were concerned with the fact that observance was spiraling out of control, and many Jews, even neighbors, would have different practices because this guy came from the house of Hillel, he came from the house of Shammai. They're friends and they're colleagues and they studied together, but in certain areas of halacha, this person would render something kosher and he would render it not kosher. So what do you do? Could you eat by their house? Could you eat from, what if they want to lend you a pot? You want to borrow a pot? You got to know which pot is this. Is it this pot? Is it that pot? In fact, the Talmud says is that what they would do is, whenever one of them would lend a pot to the other, they would lend them a pot that doesn't have any of the questions with regards to the other people. They would label the pot. This is a pot only for people of Beis Shammai. This is a pot only for people of Beis Hillel, which really creates a problem. There's a little bit of, we're one nation united under Torah and under God. And the fact that we have differences in opinion is a major problem. So the Talmud tells us in the book of Eruvin, for 3.5 years at Yavneh, they debated the two schools that are now united in Yavneh, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. They would debate, who is the halacha like? Is the halacha like us? Is the halacha like us? Of the hundreds of disagreements, they had unbelievable debate and dialogue and narrative and discussion to figure out which one is the halacha following. And this was for 3.5 years. And how did they resolve it? They resolved it because they heard a heavenly voice, a heavenly booming voice declared, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. Both the words of Beis Shammai and the words of Beis Hillel are the words of a living God. They're both true. They're both Torah. The halacha to Beis Hillel, but the halacha follows Beis Hillel. And indeed, this is emblematic of one of the major efforts that they undertook at Yavneh to create unified halacha. There was one point, like we mentioned earlier, where there was a little bit of a breakdown in Yavneh. The Romans got suspicious, and in order to kind of fly under the radar, they decided to split up. And this creates an interesting dynamic because we know there's very specific laws regarding majority. You have a Sanhedrin, and there's a question, a halacha question. We follow the majority. So if you have 70 scholars saying one way and one saying the other, or even 50 and 21, we always follow the majority. That's what the Torah says. Now, at this point in time, there was not a sufficient quorum in Yavneh to constitute a majority. And a very tragic episode happened here amongst the leaders of Yavneh that really I think, really underscores some of the tension that they were facing. And the case that they were disagreeing upon is a very esoteric case. It was, what's the halacha with regards to the purity and impurity of a certain oven? Now, in order for something to become pure or impure, it has to have the status of something which is fixed. So, for example, you want to make a vessel. You make a vessel can become impure. Something that's just raw material can't become impure. So the question arose with regards to a particular oven that got dismantled and was put together hastily. It was like, it wasn't really formed together. So is it considered a vessel that could become impure? Is it not considered a vessel? That was the debate. And they had an argument, and the two leaders, Rabbi Yoshua, on one hand, he said that it was impure. Rabbi Eliezer, on the other hand, said it was pure, and that was the argument. They took a vote, and the vote followed the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, he recognized that at this time, Yavneh does not have a sufficient quorum, because many of the scholars are elsewhere. And therefore, he reasoned that I don't need to follow the rule of majority, because the rule of majority only apply when all of Sanhedrin is united. Now we have the groups spread out into different cadres. Well, therefore, I have to just stick by what I think is true. And the Talmud records that it really devolves in a remarkable way. Rabbi Eliezer was vigorously trying to defend his position and trying to argue that he was correct, that this kind of oven indeed cannot become impure. And no matter what he said, they didn't agree with him. And he started to do things that are really surprising. He started to utilize supernatural proofs to his position. First thing he did was, he said, he pointed to a tree that was outside. He says, this tree, if I'm right, let the tree prove it. And before the eyes of all the great sages, the tree gets uprooted and it moves far away and replants itself. And he's like, oh, there you see, I'm right. And they say, I'm sorry, that's not enough proof. You have to prove it to us by convincing us in matters of Torah. You can't bring us such a proof. So he continued and he said, if the halachas like me brought them to a river, the river was flowing one direction. He says, if let the water prove that I'm right, the water starts to flow in the opposing direction. They say, well, that's not a proof. He continues and says that if the truth is like me, let the walls of the Beis Medrash, so the walls of the house of scholarship, prove it. And before you know it, the walls start to cave in. So now we have this kind of standoff. We have the walls about to collapse upon all the scholars. And then Rabbi Yoshua, who's arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, he starts screaming at the walls. And he says, listen, you have Torah scholars fighting about matters of Torah. Why are you getting involved? So the walls are a little bit, they're stuck what to do. Rabbi Eliezer is commanding them to collapse. Rabbi Yoshua is commanding them to remain erect. So they just stay like this. They just stayed kind of leaning halfway here, halfway there, because they couldn't decide. How do you determine one way or the other? And lastly, he says, if I am right, let they prove it from heaven. And a booming prophetic voice announces, why are you guys not questioning the position of Rabbi Eliezer? The position of Eliezer, he's the greatest scholar of his day. The halacha follows him whatever he says. And again, they're not impressed. And they said, the famous verse in Deuteronomy, Lo b'shamayim, Torah is not in the heavens. They might have gave us the Torah. Moshe came to the heavens, got the Torah, brought it to us. It's our Torah. Our Torah says, Achar Rabam Lahatos, you follow the majority. And even if the majority is wrong, that's what's right. What's right is to follow the majority. And therefore, it doesn't matter what they say in the heavens. It matters what we say here. And Rabbi Eliezer refused to capitulate because he believed that he did not need to follow the laws of majority rules when there was an insufficient quorum. And this was a tremendous danger, because Rabbi Eliezer, he's an unbelievable character, the greatest scholar, and this particular point in history is a time where we're trying to end dissent, and we're trying to reach consensus, and we're trying to clarify machlokes, and Rabbi Eliezer is refusing to accept the rule of the majority. Now, of course, he had his reasons to do that. He said, well, the law of the majority won't apply here. But still, this is a major problem, and this is a major challenge to the primary objective and aim of the scholars of Yavneh, and that's to decrease dissent and increase uniformity in observance. And they made a decision, Rabbi Gamliel oversaw this, to excommunicate him. And this is it's a poison pill, basically. You use it very sparingly. But they wanted to make a stand to show that Torah and the Jewish people and unity, that is the order of the day, and that trumps everything. And even someone like Rabbi Eliezer, even the greatest scholar of his time, the Chacham, the one of the Torah leaders of Yavneh, he cannot undermine that. What did they do? They sent Rabbi Akiva to go inform him. The laws of someone who's excommunicated is that no one could be in close contact with them, that you have to sit 4 arms away, etc. Rabbi Akiva put on black clothing and went and sat 4 amos away from him, so about 8 feet away from him. Rabbi Eliezer says to Rabbi Akiva, why are you doing this? Why are you behaving so unusually, so strangely? And he tells him, Rebbe, my teacher, Rabbi Eliezer was Rabbi Akiva's teacher, I think that your friends are removing themselves for you, as is the manner of someone who is mourning. Rabbi Eliezer ripped his clothing, took off his shoes, sat on the ground, and started crying. The story continues initially that when this happened, when Rabbi Eliezer was informed of his new status, Rabbi Gamliel was on a boat, on a ship. And the water started getting very choppy and very erratic. And instantly Rabbi Gamliel knew that the reason why the Almighty is about to, cause the ship to capsize is because of what he did to Rabbi Eliezer. And he's prayed to God as follows: Ribono Shalom, Master of the world, it's known that I did not do this for my own honor. I wasn't trying to stand up and say, look at me, I'm the leader, I'm the Nasi of the people in Yavneh. And I didn't do this not for the honor of the house of my family, which is the family of the princes. I did this for your honor, and in order that there should not proliferate disagreements amongst the Jewish people. When he said that, the water calmed down. Now there's an interesting wrinkle to this. If you remember, Rabbi Eliezer is actually the brother-in-law of Rabbi Gamliel. So Rabbi Eliezer's wife, she's the sister of Rabbi Gamliel, and she knows the power of her husband. Remember, the husband has unbelievable powers. He's able to pray, and the walls start collapsing. He prays, and he says something, and nature responds. Nature is beholden to him, is submitted to him, not the other way around. If he wants to prove his point, the water starts flowing the opposite direction. Now she knows that who's the most vulnerable person in the world now? That's her brother, Rabbi Gamliel. Because if Rabbi Eliezer wants, he prays to God, and he's not going to make it out. He's not going to make it. So every day she would stop him before he did the Tachnun prayer. Tachnun prayer is a prayer where you lay down on your arm. The reason why you lay down on your arm is it's a prayer of sadness. When you kind of beseech God out of sadness. So every day when Rabbi Eliezer was praying, she would make sure he didn't say that prayer. There was one day she was under the impression that it was Rosh Chodesh. On Rosh Chodesh, you don't say that prayer anyhow. Now, at that time, Rosh Chodesh depended on the moon. So sometimes it would be day 29 and 30, and sometimes it would be day 30 and 31, right? or day 31. It would be either a 29-day month or a 30-day month. So what's the first day of the next month? Either day 30, day 31. So she was under the impression that it was Rosh Chodesh. Truth is, it wasn't Rosh Chodesh. The following day was Rosh Chodesh. So she didn't stop him from saying that prayer. He said that prayer, and right away she realized what was wrong, that he said the prayer, and she said, that's it, my brother's dead. And indeed, they heard a shofar from the other end of town that indeed Rabbi Gamliel had died. But this story really shows us the character of these people. Rabbi Eliezer was one of the wealthiest people around. He could have utilized his power to have a revolt. Not only was he the greatest Torah scholar, he was the wealthiest as well. And he accepted the decision of his peers, and he ceded. He just sat down on the ground, tore his clothing, took off his shoes, and acted as a mourner because he accepted their decision, and also stood up for the greater good, recognizes also that the unity of the people superseded his own individual honor. Never did he insult anyone, never did he disparage anyone, never did he cast into suspicion the scholarship or the leadership or the piety of his, so to speak, foes. On the other hand, look at the strength of character of the people who put Rabbi Eliezer they banned him. They excommunicated him. And they knew how dangerous he was. They knew how volatile he could potentially be. And they knew he was the greatest Torah scholar. And indeed, much of the success of Yavneh was due to his greatness. He knew more Torah than anyone. You want to assemble all the Torah disagreements and clarify them? Who do you go to? You go to Rabbi Eliezer. But they realized there was something even greater than that, and that's unity. Now, he didn't recant. Very interesting. Someone's wondering, okay, you're put into excommunication, and indeed, for the rest of his life, he was excommunicated. And the question is, why did he not recant? Why did he not say, I accept the position of the scholars, and indeed, that oven is impure? Well, the reason why he did not accept it, was because he actually believed that, and he had something to stand upon. He believed that was not a Sanhedrin, that he was mandated to follow the majority, because some of the Sanhedrin was elsewhere. And therefore, and that was indeed part of his greatness, was that he had the strength of character to stick to what he believed was correct, and what he believed was, from a Torah perspective, correct, even if it meant that he had to live a life of isolation. Now, there's an interesting epilogue to his story when he was very sick. So the Talmud records a series of narratives, what happened when Rabbi Eliezer was very sick. And his students came to visit him, Rabbi Kiva amongst others. So they had to sit far away from him. They went to sit four amas away from him. And they were talking to him, and they said to him, so he tells them, well, why are you here? He says, we're here to study Torah. He says, well, why haven't you come till now? We didn't have any time. We're too busy. So Rabbi Eliezer responds to them, I will be shocked if any one of you dies a natural death. Which terrified everyone in the room. They're not going to die a natural death. So Rabbi Kiva, the greatest of his students, he says, well, what about my death? So he tells them, your death is even worse than everyone else in the room. And he gives this amazing speech. He picks up his two arms and places them on his heart. And he says to them, woe unto you. My two arms are like veritable Torah scrolls that are rolled up. What he's essentially lamenting the fact is that he's a Torah scroll. Everything in Torah he had. In fact, his teacher described him as a pit that's totally sealed. Nothing gets lost from it, but it was rolled up. Because of the circumstances of this episode, he was forced to not go and let his Torah go forth. And that's an indictment on the entire Jewish nation, especially the scholars. They didn't take Torah from him because the Torah scroll was rolled up. And he continues, I studied a lot of Torah from my teachers. My great teachers, primarily Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. but I did not diminish from their Torah nothing any more than a applier of makeup from a vial. You take a little, you want to dip the applier of makeup into a vial. The vial lasts for 5 years, but you only take a little few drops out of it. That's what I diminished from my teachers. And when I taught Torah, it was the same way. I taught Torah and I had so much Torah to teach, but the amount of Torah that was absorbed by my students was the same amount, well, with respect to how much Torah I actually know, was the same amount as if you have a dog lapping up water from the sea. The sea is so vast, the dog diminishes the sea a little bit, but really it's almost insignificant. Not only that, he starts to talk about the teachings that he has. In the laws of leprosy, he has 300 laws. No one asked me about them. And in the laws of magic, there's a prohibition against magic in the Torah. One of the popular forms of magic of the time was the collection of cucumbers magic. Not very popular today. But what they would do is they would have some sort of magic that would take all the produce of a field and bring it all to the center of the field. And that was a very obscure law of Torah, right? The laws of Torah of magic or cucumbers. If I said that, you would say it doesn't make any sense. There is no magic, and certainly not about cucumbers. But it's a very obscure law. And he says, I have 300, and maybe, according to one opinion of the Talmud, it was actually 3,000 various laws, and none of my students ever asked me about them, with the exception of Rabbi Akiva, that once we were walking, and Rabbi Akiva asked me, teach me about this magic. So they were walking past the field, he said something, and instantly all the cucumbers collected to the middle. He said something else, and the whole thing was uprooted. Either way, that was his speech. And it's very sad. It's a little bit of a sad tinge to it. I guess it's maybe even tragic. The fact that there was so much potential of Torah that was not tapped into properly. And the Gemara recounts that they started peppering him with questions, all these various questions about specifically the most complicated laws of purity and impurity. And in the midst of answering one question, they asked him about a particular item. He said it's tahor, it's pure. And as he said that, he died. And all of the assembled realized that this was really an omen of his purity himself, that his soul departed with purity. And right away, instantly, they determined to rescind the neder, to rescind the excommunication. Rabbi Yeshua, his colleague, he did that, and that indeed ended that episode. But this really shows the commitment that the sages of Yavneh had towards eliminating dissension, even if it meant bottling up the great scholar Rabbi Eliezer, that was not as important as ensuring unity in halacha. Now, Rabbi Eliezer himself has a great legacy in Torah. In fact, his name is mentioned in the Mishnah a staggering 319 times. And the Talmud tells, when Talmud gives the Talmud gives a eulogy of Rabbi Eliezer by saying that when Rabbi Eliezer died, the Torah scroll was hidden away. It's almost as if we had a Torah scroll when he was alive. Because anything you want to do, any law you could possibly imagine, thousands of laws with regards to cucumber magic, you would go to him, the Torah scroll, open the Torah scroll and ask it. And once he died, that Torah scroll was lost. But we could say that someone like Rabbi Eliezer, we learned the greatness of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Gamliel as well, but really the whole assembly of Yavneh, where as someone like Rabbi Eliezer, who was instrumental towards the organization of the Torah at the very vulnerable time period of Yavneh, but they were willing to sacrifice that relationship, compounded by the fact that it was his brother-in-law, in order to ensure that the Jewish people as a nation and the role of the Sanhedrin remains unchallenged. Yavneh and the Sanhedrin continued for hundreds of years. And the next time period, after the temple is destroyed, is one of the greatest time periods for Torah greatness and proliferation and dissemination in history. That's when you wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud. Those things could not have been written if not for this episode. If we didn't have the role of the Sanhedrin and the role of the Nasi secure, Rabbi Judah the Prince is the great-grandson of Rabbi Gamliel. He was one who got all the rabbis together, a great unifying project to write down the Mishnah. That doesn't happen unless everyone knows, and this story is just blazed into everyone's collective memory, that Sanhedrin, the body, the same body that was founded by Moses, this is an ancient body. This body trumps the individuals of the body. And that's why, and indeed, Torah is not in the heavens, the Torah is here. We're specifically in the seat of the Sanhedrin.